Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to take a look at Chapter 29, Part 2, where the Industrial Revolution went after its beginning in Great Britain, as well as some of the impact it had on our concepts of economic and social organization. By the end of this presentation, you'll be able to answer the two following essential questions. How did political, social, and economic factors affect the spread of industrial developments globally before 1945? How did social and economic ideas in industrial societies shift and respond to the changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution? With that said, let's begin. One question that students like to ask when they first learn about the Industrial Revolution is they say, well, what's the end date, right? So how can I line it up on the timeline that is world history? And the answer to that is it hasn't really ended. If you were to look around our society, you can see that we're still living in a world that is very much shaped by the Industrial Revolution. Although it hasn't ended, we do tend to describe it in phases. So one thing students should be familiar with is the quote-unquote phases of the Industrial Revolution, which are usually characterized by the technologies, sources of energy, and consumer demand. For example, the first Industrial Revolution was predominantly powered by water and coal. A great invention was the steam engine, and it centered around textiles and iron production. Whereas the second revolution that kind of comes a little bit later in the 1800s uses electricity, natural gas, and oil, focuses on steel, chemistry, and combustion engines, aka the car. Assembly line is actually a product of the second Industrial Revolution. And then as you go further, the third Industrial Revolution, which is disputed by some scholars, whether it's done or still going, the fourth Industrial Revolution, if it's even happening yet, or maybe will happen in the future, and what its features are, up for much discussion. Periodizing the Industrial Revolution can help you understand it better, but as you get closer to the present, this becomes more debated and less certain. But I always like to remind people, in the past, everyone thought we'd have flying cars, but nobody thought we'd have the internet. Let's talk about the spread of the Industrial Revolution in Europe itself. When we last left, Britain had just finished industrializing its textile industry and was arguably the only industrial nation in the world. This was put on display in the 1851 Great Exhibition, in particular the Crystal Palace, a large steel frame structure with more glass in it than had ever been produced for a single building before. This put on display for the world Britain's industrial glass production and got a lot of countries thinking maybe we should do some of this industrializing stuff. And thankfully, many British experts in machines and organization were more than happy to leave Britain. 15,000 British workers effectively helped industrialize France as well as the Low Countries. Now, a little bit further east in Europe, when we start talking about the Russian Empire or the German Confederation, later Empire, industrialization takes on a slightly more rapid pace. So, for example, a higher involvement of the government than had been seen in Great Britain. So, for example, the Russian Empire mostly wanted to industrialize because it didn't want to be militarily vulnerable to its rivals. And so industry in the Russian Empire focused on building factories to produce weapons or creating railroads like the Trans-Siberian Railway that would protect the empire. In the German Confederation, the government also had a really strong hand in promoting industry. There was less of an emphasis on military power as had been with Russia, and there was more of an emphasis on supporting large cartels that would bring prosperity to the country. The German Empire also witnessed something really interesting called state socialism, which we'll talk about socialism in a second, but the idea essentially was that it was an attempt by the state to get workers loyal to the government by giving them such things as sick leave or an old age pension. This kind of stuff would not be seen until much later in many other industrial countries. So it's an interesting sort of first step that the German government takes in an effort to alleviate some of the negative parts of industrial life. So in general, British industrialization was rather slow, whereas the German and Russian empires were industrialized much later, but much faster. And this pattern of governments taking a large role in the industrializing process of their country is going to be seen all over the world going forward in history, from China to Japan to Egypt, even post-colonial places, Africa, parts of Latin America. It's going to become a common theme that governments are going to take an active role in trying to improve their production capacity as it relates to their state. So be on the lookout for that. Outside of Europe, only two other nations successfully industrialized before 1945. And in the 1930s, the Soviet Union arguably finished the process of Russian industrialization. So a fully industrialized society did remain a fairly rare thing before World War II. Although you did see elements of the Industrial Revolution in other parts of the world, specifically in imperial holdings such as India, Algeria, and South Africa. And these places would set up factories where they could more cheaply produce goods to ship home, or they might set up railroads to help extract resources to send back home. This was an example of imperial powers using industrial technology to solidify their control. One of the key theories that has defined global economic history going forward is something called dependency theory. What dependency theory posits is very similar to this circle you see here in the right-hand corner, where you have an industrialized core, in this case Europe and the United States, and then you have a non-industrialized periphery, such as Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia, in which the core extracts resources from the periphery and then sells industrial goods back to the periphery. In many ways, the core is dependent on the periphery for resources, and the periphery is dependent on the core for industrialized goods. And we can see this in the shifting relationship between Great Britain and its colonies in India, whereas initially Great Britain imported manufactured textiles from India. Imperial control and increasing taxation policy and deindustrialization meant that by the 1900s, India was exporting the raw material of cotton to Great Britain, who was then manufacturing goods and selling it back to India. And this is a phenomenon we would see in other places. For example, newly independent countries in Latin America could not compete with industrial goods. Any small local production would be buried underneath a deluge of British industrial goods. Dependency theory also means that the nature of the economies in the periphery is centered on resource extraction. For example, they would specialize in the production of a given resource, whether that would be meat from Argentina, guano and nitrates from Chile, or rubber from Brazil or parts of West Africa. The industrializing core shapes the economic life of the periphery based on the demands of the international market, which of course is backed up by military force in the form of backed up by imperial armies and imperial warships, as would be seen in the Opium Wars in China. What's also really interesting is that the abolition of the slave trade came about during this time, and by the mid-1850s was effectively suppressed. However, all this did was shift slavery from the Caribbean and European possessions in the Caribbean to parts of West Africa, where it would then become common and used to either extract resources or cultivate other raw materials for the industrialized core. Global capitalism dependency theory is a major consequence of the global spread of the Industrial Revolution. One of the biggest changes the Industrial Revolution brought was the organization of business and the organization of finance. You might have heard the term corporation, and if you remember from earlier in AP World History, you had the joint stock companies such as the East India Company. These were arguably the first corporations. Throughout the Industrial Revolution, as more and more companies begin to act like joint stock companies, as well as more companies simply get larger and larger, we begin to see a limited liability corporation. And this is fundamentally different from earlier joint stock companies because a limited liability corporation eventually develops an independent identity. If you've ever heard a gaffe from a former presidential candidate in the United States who famously said, "Corporations are people, my friend," he meant that in a legal sense of the word, because by the end of the 1800s, corporations in most industrial countries had a separate legal identity, which meant that you as the investor in the corporation were not responsible if the corporation lost money or didn't make a profit. You were also not responsible personally for anything the corporation did. The corporation and its assets were responsible. And this is a fundamental shift because it encourages more people to get involved and more people to put forward money because there's less risk and more of a possibility of reward. But the main point is that with the increasing size of companies throughout the industrial world, financing larger and larger projects, different forms of economic organization were going to need to take place to finance and support these large business ventures. And here's where we get the stock exchange or the stock market. The exchange is literally just the building that the stock market is in. Now, you might also remember that the very first stock exchange was set up in Amsterdam to buy and sell the stock of the East India Company in 1601. But it's during the Industrial Revolution, with companies becoming so large and their projects becoming so expensive, that the practice of issuing stock becomes much more common. And hence we begin to see the proliferation of stock exchanges all over the world. In the industrial core, such as New York, London, Berlin, Paris, but also out in the imperial periphery, if you will. So, for example, India's oldest stock exchange was set up in Bombay, which is now Mumbai, by British industrialists. The same thing in Johannesburg, as well as Hong Kong and Shanghai in the late 1800s. Tokyo, as a country that was attempting to adapt and industrialize itself, also set up a stock exchange in the 1870s. So stock exchanges are really important because they represent the increase in size and scale of industrial businesses. In other words, the sheer shift in scale of economic activity, more economic activity in more places involving more people and more resources, leads to the need for more financing via the issuing of stock, and hence stock markets and stock exchanges. You might have heard the phrase monopoly, the great board game of economic thought, right? In traditional capitalist thought, a monopoly is actually a market failure. And a monopoly is when one corporation or perhaps group of corporations either has no or has eliminated any competition of any kind. It's as though there's only one ice cream store in your town, or the only ice cream store in your town has been bought up by the same person. The idea is that without any competition, a monopoly could charge whatever prices it wants and hence damage the financial health of the market and the productive health of an economy. And this was something that was seen, especially in the United States in the late 1880s, but also in parts of Europe as well. Monopolies come about sometimes through corruption, but sometimes also just because certain economic activities have such a high barrier cost to entry that you can't effectively have more than one company participating in an economic activity. So for example, how many power companies exist in your town? If you are like me and you live in an average American town, you probably only have one option for cable, one option for electricity, one option for gas, and that is a kind of monopoly in a way. But an even more interesting question about monopolies that's going on in the United States in the early 21st century. Is our definition of a monopoly outdated? This question has arisen because a number of people have pointed out that large tech firms, data firms, do effectively have monopolies on certain websites and forms of social media. I'm talking about Facebook, Amazon, Google, and you can probably think of a few other ones. Critics have charged that these are monopolies because they effectively have no competition, or they have smothered or co-opted all of their competition. The companies themselves have pointed out that even if they are monopolies, there has been no effect to the consumer, individuals buying goods. If anything, Amazon has made things cheaper and more efficient than if they were spread out through many companies. So there is an ongoing debate as to whether perhaps our definition of a monopoly as hurting the consumer and raising prices might be a bit of an outdated definition. So just something to think about next time you need something off Amazon. Let's talk about some new ideas from the Industrial Revolution. So one of the biggest ideas to become popularized and still has a huge impact on our world today is the idea of laissez-faire, basically what we call capitalism. Laissez-faire is a French phrase. It means let them do. We basically call it capitalism. It's essentially the same thing. It comes out of Adam Smith's ideas, who was also influenced by some French Enlightenment thinkers named physiocrats. But Adam Smith essentially argued of a few really important things that are going to be critical to capitalism. One is that he didn't like mercantilism, which is that system by which European monarchs had absolute control over their economy. He preferred free trade, and he argued that every nation should work on producing whatever they're best at, and then they can trade that for whatever they need from another nation. He also talked about something called an invisible hand of the market. Essentially, supply and demand will be shaped by the invisible hand of the market. If something doesn't exist, it's because there's no demand of it. If there's no supply, there won't be any demand. If there is demand, there will be supply. In other words, if people want something, somebody will make a business out of providing it for them. In this economic worldview, the job of the government is to very simply regulate contracts and keep a stable society. The government doesn't play any roles such as would have been seen under mercantilism, right? No restrictions on trade, no favored royal companies, no aristocratic privilege that determines who gets what land or what resources. And to an extent, pretty much every industrializing nation adopted these policies to some extent. Usually internally, they allowed free trade to go on. Almost every industrialization kept up external trade barriers, that's tariffs and taxes on imports, until the early to mid 1900s. Great Britain adopted full-on free trade, but interestingly enough, kept their colonies as protected markets they did not let people trade with. They also were not afraid to use their military power to force other people to trade with them, even if they didn't want to. And we'll see this when we talk about imperialism. If you've ever heard anybody say something along the lines of there's too many people in the world, then you've probably heard someone talk about the ideas of Thomas Malthus. Now, Thomas Malthus was a mathematician and a cleric. And during the Industrial Revolution, he began to see one of its impacts, which was a rise in populations. And he theorized that this was going to be a huge problem. He argued that the population, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, was growing too fast, and soon we're going to be caught in a cycle of misery where we'll have too many people and not enough food, and then there'll be death and famine and war. This is called a Malthusian population trap, and this is usually what people are talking about when they talk about overpopulation. The Industrial Revolution made possible the acquisition of basic necessities of life at a much cheaper scale. Food was cheaper, basic foods were cheaper, basic clothing was cheaper. Fewer people were dying, and so the population was increasing. Also, cities were increasing, which cities do tend to concentrate poverty in a single area. And so to John Malthus, this was all proof of overpopulation and its dangers. Now, lots of people have argued against the ideas of Malthusianism, and there's good reason to be skeptical of this claim that population will always outstrip supply. But what's interesting historically is that these ideas, Thomas Malthus's ideas, because he wasn't just a nobody, he was actually very well known, influenced the response to a number of famines and food shortages around the world, including the Irish potato famine in the 1840s and the famine in British India in 1877. In both cases, Malthusian ideas influenced the relief efforts in the sense that they minimized or eliminated relief efforts altogether under the principles of a correction to the overpopulation of the area. Not everybody went along with the Industrial Revolution or its ideas or its social consequences, and many people did oppose them. Now, you may have heard this phrase, Luddite, usually describing someone who is anti-technology or someone who fights technological change. And that is true. The Luddites were known for smashing machines. There are many famous illustrations of them smashing machines. But it's not that they were anti-machine. They were simply protesting their shift in conditions. Many skilled weavers losing their jobs to machines or seeing their living standards decrease as a result of machines. And they felt the only way they could impact the factory owners or protest their conditions were to destroy the machines. So to say the Luddites were anti-machine would probably be an incorrect statement. It would be more accurate to say that they simply were an industrial labor movement seeking to improve their conditions. Destroying machines was the way they went about that. But for the most part, most laborers weren't Luddites that went around smashing machines, but laborers would create work unions. That's where all the laborers in a certain factory or in a certain area, or sometimes even in a certain industry, would come together and they would agree collectively to not work. This is called a strike in an attempt to negotiate better conditions. For example, maybe a rise in wages. This is called a strike. And there are a number of famous strikes throughout history. It should be noted, though, that organizing into labor unions and trade unions and going on strike was illegal for most of the Industrial Revolution in most industrial nations. So strikers and trade unions were not acknowledged and sometimes were met with violence by the soldiers of a government or the hired police force of a company or factory. Then you have a group of individuals known as socialists and the idea of socialism. And there's two branches of this. One is there's a group known as Utopian Socialists, where individuals who critiqued the social impact of the Industrial Revolution, the shift from farming to wage labor, the shift from creating your own products to creating a product for someone else. They criticized these ideas. And what they sought to do was literally separate themselves from industrial society. So for example, they would create cities such as New Lanark in Scotland, where they would arrange society not along industrial lines. They would set limits on working hours, which did not typically exist. They would provide free education, which at the time did not exist. They would provide subsidized food so everyone had enough to eat. The idea being that they were going to create a new society that rejected the way the industrial society at the time was going. And this movement of utopian communities was spread throughout the United States. Then we come to socialism in its contemporary sense. Socialism in its contemporary sense, an oft repeated but poorly understood term. Socialism, the word, is a rejection of liberalism, which we talked about in the last lecture series from chapter 28, in the sense that it perceives the community as being more important than the individual. And while every socialist movement is different, in general, it is a peaceful approach to giving workers power and giving workers control of industrial production. Whereas communism, which I'm going to talk about in a second, emphasizes a violent revolution, or at least a revolution. Socialism generally advocates for a peaceful approach to worker empowerment and worker control. You might have also heard the phrase social democracy, although in the United States, we get this term confused with democratic socialism because of a certain 2016 political candidate who kept running around calling himself a democratic socialist when he's actually a social democrat. And social democracy is a form of government, which is a democracy, but seeks to use the power of the government to minimize the hardships and the negative effects of industrial life and in the industrial economy. And now let us talk about the one that everybody's been waiting for, that is communism. And the Communist Manifesto, which Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels put out in 1848, which laid out their blueprint for the workers' revolution. Just kidding. All they did was critique industrial society. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were two thinkers from Germany who were students of philosophy and And their whole body of work is simply them critiquing what they see as industrial capitalism. It's not a blueprint for revolution. It is true that Marx talked about the idea of a workers' revolution, a dictatorship of the proletariat, but what he actually meant by that, what it would look like when it was done, was up for debate and really wasn't clear. It was very uncertain what that would actually be. Karl Marx's basic ideas with communism is that history is a class struggle. And throughout history, there have been groups of laborers and groups of owners who have struggled with each other. This has happened all over the world. It's happened in different ways, in different phases. But according to Marx, industrial capitalism, the world of the 1880s, was the final struggle because there were so few owners and so many producers, the owners being the bourgeoisie and the producers being the proletariat. And the proletariat was so alienated. People no longer created anything for themselves. What I mean by this is that historically, if you lived on a farm, you made everything you needed for yourself. You grew your own food, you sewed your own clothing, you created your own tools. You might have bought and sold with your neighbor, but that was a rarity. Now everyone's working in a factory creating stuff that's not for them, and sometimes they can't even afford. This is what Marx means when he talks about labor alienation. If you've ever had a service sector retail job, you probably understand labor alienation better than you think. The other major critique of Marx is that industrial capitalism is inherently unstable. What he said was that the pursuit of profit, which leads to more efficient production, which removes labor from the production process, leads to a crisis where people can no longer even buy the things that they create. Therefore, there is a glut in the market and the profits fall. This leads to a crisis, which he observed as the number of financial panics that were occurring throughout the industrialized world in the 1850s, 1870s, 1890s, and early 20th century. And he saw these crises as repeating again and again and again. The pursuit of markets to sell industrial goods and raw materials to make industrial goods would inevitably lead to imperial war, imperial conquest, and competition between industrialized powers. It's probably safe to say on that critique, he was pretty spot on. All of this would accumulate, according to Marx, in the final crisis of capitalism, in which the proletariat, aka the mass of laborers, alienated workers, would rise up. They would take control of the means of production, aka the factories, the farm equipment, anything used to produce a good. They would rise up and they would take control of it. And then they would redistribute it amongst themselves, and then everybody would have control of the means of productions, and we'd live in a governmentless society. This is what communism would be in Marx's point of view. And again, I really need to emphasize that Karl Marx himself didn't say very much about what was going to happen in this new communist society. What it would look like is going to be largely fleshed out by future communist thinkers going forward into the 19th and 20th century. Nonetheless, communism and its ideas did inspire a number of movements and actions. For example, the Paris Commune, which was a very short-lived radical government in the city of Paris, was largely inspired by communist ideas and passed a number of laws that are somewhat communist in nature, such as workers getting to own factories and the redistribution of land. Although the Paris Commune didn't last very long and those laws never had their chance to have a full effect, nonetheless, communism would go on to inspire those who sought to resist the negative social and economic effects of the Industrial Revolution on society. Thank you so much for joining me. You should be able to answer those 2 questions from the beginning of the presentation. My name is Mr. Little, and I will see you next time. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was able to help you. If you appreciate this kind of work, please like and subscribe. And of course, I welcome any kind of feedback or suggestions, so feel free to leave a comment down below. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.